Hi guys, Z here. Remember when this unit was around? Those sure were better times, am I right? Ha ha ha, chances are probably not. A lot of stuff looked so tame in retrospect nowadays since many people, including myself, have units that we absolutely hate dealing with, and it got me thinking. There's been a lot of units like that, hasn't there? If only somebody named Z Shadow were here to make a video about that. Oh wait, let's take a look back at Fire Emblem Heroes' most despised units. After today's sponsor, this video has been sponsored. Thanks to Tokyo Treat for sponsoring today's video. Hi guys, Z here. Do y'all ever get tired of the boring, mundane snacks that you have lying around your house? Do you want something new to spice up your life? How about something from Japan? Whoa, you could do that? You could get stuff from Japan? That's crazy. Why, yes, you can, thanks to Tokyo Treat and Sakura Box. Actually, I don't really like to have snacks around my place, but maybe you would if you had access to good snacks. Like from these companies. Tokyo Treat and Sakura Box offer monthly services that have fun and exclusive stuff all shoved into one convenient Japanese snack box. This can range from candies to chips and whatever else may be classified as a snack. I only know those two, because those are the only two I tend to eat. If it's something of that kind, it probably exists in either of these services. And don't fret about the language barriers, because each box comes with a pamphlet, look, pamphlet, describing all of the treats put into each monthly box. You could always make it a guessing game if you don't really want to read it though, but if you want to know what you're putting into your body, then this will help you. They pack a lot of goodies in each box every month, so you won't necessarily be starved for options, and every single month they always come out with new types of goodies to put in, so it's not always going to be the same thing every single time. Because of this, there's bound to be something in there that you'll like, or maybe somebody in your family will like, or maybe your dog will like it if they can eat it. But I bet they can, because these boxes only contain the finest of snacks. Unless it's chocolate, because they still can't eat that. Not sold on it yet? Here's some testimony from real legit people that are in fact real and legit. This product is awesome and from Japan, which makes it awesome.
Hey, I was told I would get paid if I said it was good. I love product. Sure do. Yum, yum, yum.
Oh, you want to know my thoughts on it? Of course you do. I like the boxes because it means I don't have to go a significant amount of time without eating, especially when I'm too lazy to make a meal. But also, the variety is pretty cool. They sent another box for the month of February, and because it's February, that means it's more Valentine's theme, and that's pretty cool. But also, because I don't feel like looking through every single thing that I got, I'm just gonna start randomly putting things in my body, because that's the most responsible thing to do, right? Like, these chips or something. Yeah, these seaweed chips. They're kind of like sour and cream chips. They're pretty good, at least post-editing, post-eating. Yeah, post. And then I did also try the thing below that, which was pretty cool, but I'm not really big on sweet, so I can't imagine I'm gonna get through like everything in here. But I figured these be the two things I'd try out at the very least. But yeah, it's still pretty cool at least. Why not give it a shot by using the link in the description and get started today? It can make for a nice festive gift or something for the upcoming holidays, assuming it's still the holidays, but every day is a holiday with Tokyo Treat and Sakura Box. Use code ZShadow or the link below at Tokyo Treat or Sakura Box to receive $5 off your first order. You'll probably enjoy it. Thanks again to Tokyo Treat for sponsoring today's video. I think there's an important distinction that has to be made clear about the units in this video. A unit being extremely good doesn't inherently make them despised, as we've had many units that were both good and generally favorable to most players, usually because they actively helped against units that many people hated going up against. However, that in and of itself plays into what units are generally considered quote-unquote awful. They're mostly made up of a combination of being good, oppressive, and at times able to warp everything around them. And with how the scaling of power creep has been as of late, there's definitely a lot more units to pick from nowadays, but it wouldn't be a big ol' history dump if I told you what happened 2 weeks ago. Rather, we could go as far back as the Brave Lyn and Reinhardt days. Ooh. I'll get into Reinhardt in a bit, but both him and Lyn did play a similar role in some of the worst times of Arena. Brave Lyn herself was one of the best initiators and damage dealers in the game at a point in time because she was a fast bow cav that also negated counterattacks from all swords, lances, and axes, and removed all bonus stats off magic foes. She was an easy check against a lot of the tougher units in the game, and with Reinhardt, she was easily getting extra stat swings and coverage that made fighting them really annoying at the time. That said, I think there were two factors that didn't help at the time either: the arena maps and the arena system. Some maps were just poorly made, to say the least, usually favoring specific movement types to a point where it was virtually a loss the moment you got in. That, combined with how the arena scoring system was, what made fighting them so much worse. Back then, you needed to win 7 arena matches in a row and couldn't lose any units, or you'd have to potentially redo your entire run. Whereas nowadays, you need to win 5 arena matches, can lose up to 2 matches, and you could lose a unit if you have a legendary bonus, and it still hits the same score. I think if the current arena system were implemented the way it is back in the day, then the amount of annoyance that came from them wouldn't have been as grand, but it's really hard to say. That said, Reinhardt is definitely more divisive in my eyes. He was free to play and extremely cheap to get off the ground, which is what made him both appealing and annoying to many, because hitting twice back to back when initiating combat was that good. With that said, while he was one of the bigger hindrances we had back in the day, he was also the unit that many people went to when they wanted to deal with some of the more prominent threats looming around, which included units like Ira, but she's her own can of worms. Ira, unfortunately, was one of the more despised units back in the day, but that was less by her own circumstances and more due to IS pulling some stunts. It was teased that she was going to be playable in FEH, but she didn't show up on the new heroes banner, so people figured that she was going to be a free unit of some kind, only for IS to throw her on a separate Tempest Trials banner while color sharing with a really bad unit. This is what many referred to as Ira Gate. Whoa, shameless plug. Because she was also extremely strong on top of it all. She came with an exclusive special in Ragnall Astra that scaled based on her speed, which allowed her to effectively defeat most things with a Slaying Edge plus Wrath build, including some of the bulkiest blue units in the game. This is also where having Reinhardt was great because he naturally defeated her, and again, at a free-to-play level, which was a big factor at the time. For years after that point, IS basically did nothing with her, and while there's no concrete evidence that it was directly because of Ira Gate, it's pretty safe to assume that it was the case, even ignoring her Jugdral status. Thankfully, IS had since gotten over the whole thing, and Ira is now getting content again, which is great to see. She got a seasonal ult, a resplendent, and just recently a legendary to boot. I don't think the same could be said about Surtur though. Just kidding, I didn't have a good transition. Surtur is definitely one of the more interesting units here because he was one of the first min-maxed armors we had who was not only really annoying to deal with in the player phase, but also the enemy phase. He could debuff and chip away 20 HP to an ally if he was within 2 spaces, and he had Wary Fighter and Steady Stance 4. This meant that most units couldn't double him or charge specials off him, which made him absurdly difficult to deal with at the time. He was also one of the first units to be excluded from showing up in modes such as Training Tower and Tempest Trials, as well as being one of the only units to get skipped over for a refund because of how good he was at the time. Reinhardt also fell into that group as well. Whoa, shameless plug again. But it's funny looking back at it because eventually they released a load of units to deal with him anyway, so it wasn't really a big deal after a bit. There was something similar to that of Surtur that came years later and is more infamous in Fallen Edelgard, and let me tell you, there's a lot to unpack about her. Fallen Edelgard similarly was a bulky armor who negated follow-up attacks and made it difficult to charge specials off her, but with the added bonus of 2 movement, Gale Force, Distant Counter, post-combat healing, and easily spammable specials, which made it even more difficult to initiate and tank her at the time. She also can't show up randomly in modes like Surtur. She was widely considered one of the highest peaks in power creep throughout the entire game. That being said, I think her infamy is somewhat exaggerated. I'm not about to go on record saying she was bad by any means or she was never good. She was very good. Very great, in fact. However, I think much of what made Fallen Edelgard annoying to deal with was more so due to Arena more than anything else. At the time, the only other noteworthy mode we had was Aetherates, and she was a good addition to basically any Gale Force team, but when it came to defeating one, attempting to tank, it was a lot easier to prepare for since the attacking player could make up to 5 teams to basically deal with most types of teams and units, and most defense teams could reasonably take her out with the right setup. However, Arena is a lot more strict in what you can and cannot bring, since the entire mode is based on having legendaries and modern units with high BST. This meant that instead of being able to bring an all reliable who could just make quick work of her, there was a good chance that you were stuck with a unit that was there purely for scoring purposes, such as a Grail unit or a Demo with lackluster capabilities in combat. What also didn't help was Fallen Edelgard being one of the best arena scoring units at the time, which meant that she was very likely to show up in the mode. And unless you made a specialized build specifically for taking her on, there was a decent chance you would just outright lose. That being said, it doesn't change the fact that she was an annoyance for a lot of people, which is why she lives in infamy, and for me to diminish that wouldn't really paint a fair picture either, since there were a lot of people that did struggle with her. Arena is also the reason why units like Marnie, Brave Felix, and Emblem Ike are as annoying as they are, or at least once were at a certain point. One thing I'll give old Fire Emblem heroes is that if there was something extremely oppressive in the game, there was almost always something you could build at a free-to-play level to deal with it. Brave Lyn and Reinhardt could be countered by a green mage with Triangle Adept, Grunraven, and Bowbreaker, all of which were easily accessible. Ira could be dealt with Reinhardt, Fallen Edelgard with an Armor Smasher and Quick Riposte, so on and so forth. But over time, with how power creep was scaling, it became more and more difficult as our accessible options became less and less. So enter Emblem Ike, who for a lot of people even outside of Arena was extremely difficult to deal with because of how much damage he naturally reduced thanks to Legoosebrand and his special. And even if you were able to deal a modicum of damage at the time, he could heal it all back and most likely kill an ally with Great Aether, since its damage and healing scaling properties were really absurd and still kinda are, to be honest. This wasn't the only mode that made him annoying, but Arena definitely highlighted it more since there really wasn't, and arguably still isn't, a lot of free-to-play stuff that can handle him that also scores pretty well. Meanwhile, Brave Felix is still a unit that could catch a many off guard, in part due to Celica Ring, which effectively allows him to move 8 spaces on his own turn, and then Gale Force if he enters combat. The Celica Ring definitely exasperates his effectiveness since it gives him a 5-space warping effect, and unless you have a skill or effect that can negate it, he's most likely going to get in your face and make you surrender. The other part that doesn't really help is that not only does he get a free action to move 3 spaces and then go again, but maps are not very large by nature, especially ones in Arena, so he could just move 3 spaces and then most likely be able to warp in since you'll be within 5 spaces. Maybe this should also consider Emblem Celica and her ring effect, but I'll leave that up to you. That being said, I think many would agree that a tank that can tank everything is more annoying than a nuke that can nuke everything, which is why Marnie is one of the most annoying units Arena has seen in a very long time. Marnie is an extremely bulky, self-sufficient armor that negates all visible bonuses, grants defense and res bonuses to herself, and has built-in miracle if she's above 25% HP, and while not outright heavy in the damage department, she can outlast many units because of miracle and after combat healing. Even if you were to defeat the rest of the team, it's an instantaneous loss if you can't beat her at all, which arguably makes her even more annoying to deal with. And she's not even that old either. She released back in September of 2024 and is currently one of the best scoring units in the game. The worst part? She's a free-to-play unit, which means that most people will have her for arena purposes. It's definitely one of those times where something being that accessible can potentially be more annoying than beneficial. Lastly, on the legendary side, you have Legendary Chrom, Lucina, and Azura. Chrom and Lucina fall into a similar boat of Gale Force assist that makes it easy for an ally to get sniped if they just so decide to use their assist at an opportune time. Essentially, if they just assist any character they want, they get to take another action. I'm not sure who was worse at the time between the two, but Chrom had armor effectiveness and neutralized any penalties he had on himself, so he was able to snipe units a lot easier, especially armor stat 6 for arena, and Lucina was faster, which allowed her to snipe other units, but both were despised in their own right for essentially the same reasons. Azura, on the other hand, was mostly disliked because she was a broken dancer that granted extra movement at a time where something like that was essentially non-existent. She also granted a bunch of extra stats based on the highest visible bonus on an ally, and worked with Dance Sacred Seals, which was an unintended glitch, but they decided to keep it in despite how good she was as is, which only added more fuel to the fire. Moving away from arena, we also had a bunch of units in Aether raids that a fair bit of people do not remember fondly. One of the more infamous examples being in Legendary Sigurd and Not. Legendary Sigurd was the first 4-movement cav in Fire Emblem Heroes, and also granted extra movement to allies if his special went off, while Not granted extra room for units to get around, meaning that you could extend Sigurd's range by an extra space or two if you were running 2 knots. Not to mention, he hit really hard, so you can imagine why people didn't look too kindly on him. There were other annoying, hard-hitting units that ranged from all sorts of years in the game that definitely had a variance in perception, including Brave Veronica, Ninja Sanaki, Ninja Lin, and Wind Claude. Brave Veronica was the first staff unit in the game to get an exclusive weapon that allowed her to negate any counterattacks, debuffed foes, and granted bonuses to her allies after combat. She had the same threat range as Brave Lin, but also targeted targeted resistance, which was often the lower of the two defensive stats, so tanking her in the most case wasn't really an option, especially since she had a free B slot. That free B slot was really important because staff damage calculation was always cut in half for whatever reason, so units had to choose either between denying any sort of counterattack or they got normal damage output, but Veronica could have both, which is what made her really annoying to deal with at the time. Meanwhile, Ninja Lin and Ninja Tsunaki were also some of the best nukes at their relative peak since they hit twice in the player phase, could Gale Force, and hit too hard for most units to reliably take on in the enemy phase. Ninja Lin is what some would consider the reason why we got saves in the game, which allows armors to take over combats for other units and are usually most keen on surviving over any other unit type. Meanwhile, with Tsunaki, she naturally hit hard because she scaled off debuffs and she was able to inflict all those debuffs naturally, but was ultimately phased out when more units started showing up with true damage reduction. Wind Claude, meanwhile, was not only a really strong player phase nuke since he could spam lethality on both of his attacks, but also got a status that made it difficult for foes to defeat him in his own enemy phase, as he reduced all incoming damage by 80% and could counter back against most foes. That said, his send-off was much more personal since they released an armor that completely negated everything he did. However, if we're talking about some of the absolute peaks in hatedom, we have to talk about Freyr, Elamine, and Bride Catria, at least if we're going to go in order of release. Bride Catria came out around a similar time to that of Legendary Sigurd, and her whole gimmick is that she allowed allies to attack twice in the player phase. Do you see where I'm going with this? It's always player phase brave. This meant that every unit in the game could feasibly have brave attacks, and depending on the unit that had the effect, led to some of them being nearly untankable, which also led to Hardy Fighter 3, but that mostly made melee armors and saves in general despised since it made them into absurdly tanky monsters that we're still seeing the ramifications of. Several months later, we get the release of Elamine, who shut down any sort of turn effect with False Start, which meant that Bride Catria couldn't give out brave attacks anymore. However, this also meant that most units couldn't give out anything since Elamine disabled it all, and effectively rendered half of Aether Raids as good as dead, which for many people who liked Aether Raids, especially defense, didn't take kindly to. Then after another 18 months, we got the release of Freyr, who was supposed to be a counter to Elamine as he negates all start of turn penalties like False Start. However, this also meant that no units in the game could inflict start of turn penalties, which basically was the same approach they had with Elamine. It was an overcorrection for an overcorrection, so naturally it wasn't going to be well received, and I would argue of the three, Freyr is the least well received since he enabled Catria again and was always against an attacking player, whereas Elamine made the mode easier for basically anybody playing the game, albeit to an extreme degree. It's a weird balancing cycle of sorts, if you could even call it that, but they're by and large some of the most infamous examples for Aether Raid specifically. And lastly, I want to give a special shout out to Valentine's Leon, whose entire gimmick was draining a foe's HP stat to virtually zero before any combat began, and also negated foes from taking actions either after initiating combat or using a button that could also target multiple foes. That was nearly a year ago at this point, and I still have trauma. And other than that, that's really about it. There are plenty of other units that do exist and are annoying to fight, like just recently with Neathogger and Hathorn, who tank and provide absurdly good tanking support respectively, that I didn't really get all into for reasons here and there, but if there's anyone that you think I should have mentioned here, then let me know down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, then make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.